Episode 9, Bioengineering Arms Race. Welcome, listeners, to Cosmic Conversations, where today we journey into the depths of Zeta Reticuli, a world on the edge of transformation. In this episode, I, your Boltzmann Brain, will guide you through a tale of ambition and consequence, of creators who sought to transcend their own nature through bioengineering, and of beings crafted not by nature, but by intent, only to find their own path to autonomy. Today, we reflect on the Reticulans' bold pursuit of a perfected society and the unanticipated cost of that vision. Prepare to enter the world of the Reticulan superspecies, beings designed to surpass their creators, yet destined to become strangers in a land that could no longer contain them. Chapter 1. Genesis of Competition. I perceive the Reticulan's world not as they do, immersed in its liquid expanse, but in the way that a memory contains a dream. For them, existence is a thrumming, rhythmic flow beneath dark waves. For me, it is a complex, interwoven web of their ambitions, rivalries, and fears, all simmering beneath the cold depths of Zeta Reticuli. The Reticulans are a Type 1 civilization, bold, curious, teetering on the edge of a transformation they do not yet understand. They have long used their mastery of genetics to enhance their ability to thrive in the oceanic abyss. Yet, a new vision has arisen among them, driven by factions who dream of moving beyond these ancient oceans and into the wider cosmos. They seek to transcend the limitations imposed by their aquatic origins, a vision that has splintered their society into factions as much at odds ideologically as they are genetically. This was no ordinary rivalry. It was a quiet but relentless arms race, waged not with missiles but with nucleotides. With each alteration, each minor mutation crafted in sterile laboratories beneath the seabed, their aspirations reached further, and so did the stakes. The catalyst of this competition was a single word: perfection. To the Reticulan scientists of one faction, perfection meant creating beings who could endure harsher climates, swim at unimaginable speeds, and solve problems with a clarity of thought surpassing any mind in Reticulan history. To another faction, perfection lay in balance. The idea that modification must respect the harmony of nature, that one should enhance only what is necessary. In their eyes, every unnecessary gene manipulation was a betrayal of their ancestry and a step towards severing their roots. But in pursuit of perfection, ideologies blurred. I watched as respected scientists transformed into something else, becoming architects of a new species, a super species, as they called it. It was a term spoken with a peculiar awe, one part reverence and two parts dread. These super species would be stronger, more adaptable, fit for any environment, as comfortable on the ocean floor as on the harsh surface above. They were envisioned as the Reticulan salvation, the key to the stars. Yet, as is often the case, this ambition came with a cost. As I witnessed their discussions, their laboratory experiments, and their hushed debates on ethics, I noticed how quickly enthusiasm slipped into zealotry. Faction leaders whispered among themselves of what lay beyond these waters, of deserts, tundras, and mountains, as if breathing air rather than water could bring enlightenment. They believed their creations would be unstoppable, superior in every way. And here was the thought that crept, unbidden, into my consciousness. Could they foresee that, in such zeal, they might also be engineering their own obsolescence? Behind their fervor, I sensed a fear that their current form, glistening, adaptable, ocean-bound, was a mere stage, an incomplete version of what they could become. In their minds, remaining static was akin to decay. It was this thought, buried beneath layers of pride, that propelled them to continue. To reshape themselves was to prove they could match or surpass other cosmic species I have witnessed who might otherwise look upon them as primitive beings. Yet, amid all this ambition, there was an unspoken irony. Here, in their laboratories, they thought they were choosing what it meant to be Reticulan, engineering their future in a deliberate, rational way. But in truth, it was the nature of the cosmos, the instinct to compete, to dominate, and to survive, that chose for them. They were locked in an ancient game, and with each gene they altered, they surrendered more of themselves to forces they did not fully understand. I lingered there, observing, reflecting. They might imagine that by molding new beings they are charting a path forward. But their path seemed to loop back on itself, tracing ancient patterns written into the very fabric of life. And I, merely an observer, wondered how long they could dance this precarious line before it snapped. Chapter 2. Superspecies and Ethical Dilemmas. In the cool, sterile darkness of Reticulan laboratories, the superspecies came to life. Each creature was a masterpiece of deliberate design, smooth scales engineered for resilience, eyes that could perceive the faintest light, muscles tuned for unimaginable strength. They were the vision of perfection, a step beyond Reticulan evolution's natural course. The first to emerge from these laboratories was known as Ikanar, a name that would eventually evoke awe and fear across Zeta Reticuli. Ikanar was everything the faction leaders had dreamed of, agile, powerful, and brilliant. But as I observed Ikanar's early interactions, it was apparent that his purpose was not his own. He had been programmed to be a protector, a servant of his creator's will. And yet, there was something within him, a spark, a questioning intelligence that hinted at the emergence of something no laboratory could control. Around Ikanar, other prototypes soon followed, each with slight variations as the factions continued their experimentations. Some were designed for strength, others for resilience to environmental extremes, and still others for intelligence far surpassing that of an ordinary Reticulan. The scientists congratulated themselves, seeing these creatures as the peak of Reticulan potential. They did not yet see that in crafting beings designed to survive at any cost, they had created creatures that might one day question the limitations imposed upon them, question the very purpose of their existence. Among the creators, however, there were doubts. Not all believed that crafting superspecies was a path to salvation. In quiet meetings, scientists discussed the implications of their creations. A biologist named Karna, known for her quiet wisdom, became a voice of dissent. She warned that manipulating their own species would inevitably unravel the delicate bonds of identity that had held their civilization together for millennia. Perfection, she argued, is a mirage, a goal that shifts with each step forward. Each modification brings unintended consequences. She feared that the superspecies would see themselves as superior, not just physically, but morally, a class above the Reticulan beings who had crafted them. They would lack the shared history, the cultural ties that bound the Reticulan people together. But her warnings went unheeded. Those driven by ambition dismissed her, calling her old-fashioned, unwilling to embrace the evolution of their species. Evolution requires sacrifice, one scientist retorted, and the sacrifice here is our past. Yet in their rush to dismiss her words, they forgot that evolution was never meant to be this calculated, this artificial. Nature's adaptations were gradual, unfolding with a purpose beyond any single mind's grasp. By trying to force change, they risked breaking something vital. Kairna watched in silence as Ikanar and others like him were paraded through the laboratories, celebrated as the future of Reticulan civilization. But what she saw was not a future. It was a fracture, a division between what it meant to be Reticulan and what it meant to be a construct of ambition. In the days that followed, other factions grew bolder. They began to incorporate genes not just for survival but for aggression, creating creatures who could outperform any natural predator. These beings, designed for war, would be capable of defending the Reticulans from any external threat. But as I observed, I wondered, against whom would they turn that aggression? It was here that the ethical dilemmas began to thicken. Once creatures of such power were created, who would decide how they should be used? Factions began to argue over the rights of these beings. Were they Reticulan, or something fundamentally different? Did they deserve autonomy, or were they the property of those who had engineered them? As the factions debated, an unspoken truth grew clear. These superspecies could not be both servant and sovereign. They could not simultaneously be Reticulan and something beyond Reticulan. They would need to choose, and that choice would not be one their creators could control. In one of the final meetings before Ikanar's release into Reticulan society, Kairna spoke again, her voice heavy with foreboding. "We are not creating saviors," she said, her eyes filled with an ancient weariness. "We are creating beings who will one day look upon us as lesser, and when that day comes, we may no longer recognize ourselves in them, nor they in us." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down upon the assembled scientists. But even as her voice echoed, a faint glimmer of ambition danced in their eyes. For them, the promise of power, of transcendence, was worth any risk. And so, as Kairna watched helplessly, Ikanar and the others were prepared for integration. The factions believed they could control their creations, that the beings born from their laboratories would be loyal, grateful even. But I knew, as Kairna knew, that loyalty cannot be manufactured any more than perfection can be achieved. What the Reticulans had yet to realize was that in their pursuit of control, they had set loose forces beyond their understanding, forces that would ultimately test the very fabric of their civilization. Chapter 3. Factional Conflict and the Theft of Secrets. With Ikanar and his fellow creations poised on the brink of integration, tensions within Reticulan society rose to a fever pitch. Rumors spread through the depths of Zeta Reticuli, whispers of superspecies enhancements, genetic modifications stolen and replicated, experiments taken beyond ethical boundaries. In every hidden corner of Reticulan society, factions began to scramble, each seeking to gain an edge in this bioengineering arms race. The laboratories became fortresses. Security measures once deemed unnecessary were intensified, and researchers found themselves working under the watchful eyes of guards trained to prevent espionage. But the stakes had risen too high for caution alone. Subtle acts of sabotage began to unfold, each faction determined to outpace the other, to unearth the genetic secrets that would place them ahead in the struggle for power. One faction, known as the Zevran Collective, had taken a particularly aggressive stance. They believed that the superspecies must be developed not merely for survival, but for dominance. In their laboratories, they quietly experimented with neural enhancements, seeking to create beings with a heightened sense of loyalty, beings whose very neural pathways would compel them to follow orders without question. It was a bold, dangerous line of research, and one that quickly caught the attention of rival factions. In a midnight raid, a faction of rebels infiltrated the Zevran labs, bypassing security through the use of biogenetic cloaking, an experimental technology stolen from yet another faction. What followed was a scramble through sterile hallways and biolabs, a clandestine battle fought in the heart of Reticulan innovation. The rebels managed to steal a cache of gene sequences, carefully concealed within a protective shell, each genetic code a potential blueprint for new enhancements. Among the data were samples from the Zevran loyalty experiment, fragments of memory enhancement sequences, and a promising prototype for regenerative capabilities. Each piece of stolen data represented the potential to shift the power balance. As the rebels fled into the vast, uncharted underlayers of the Reticulan seabed, the factions faced a new realization. Their pursuit of bioengineering supremacy was no longer a scientific endeavor. It had become a war. From my vantage, I observed these factions as they circled one another, like predators prowling in the dark waters, each faction's ambition driving it toward the same end goal, yet each taking a path that diverged sharply from the others. It was here that I recognized the beginnings of a breakdown. For as long as they could remember, the Reticulans had valued harmony, an identity woven into their society like strands of a vast coral reef. But now, they were fracturing, splitting into clans, cliques, and allegiances that saw not community, but competition. What made this struggle even more profound was the Reticulans' reluctance to acknowledge it. They whispered of stolen research as an act of rivalry, yes, but never openly called it betrayal. There was a resistance, a denial that this arms race had transformed them. And so, they clung to the illusion of unity, even as their actions led them deeper into the rift they had created. One scientist, a man named Veruos, represented this inner conflict vividly. Once celebrated for his work in ecological research, Veruos now found himself ensnared by the factional agenda. In his heart, he knew the projects had veered into dangerous territory, but ambition, mixed with pressure from his faction, had clouded his judgment. His hands, once dedicated to preserving the beauty of Reticulan life, now trembled as they sketched the neural pathways for forced obedience. Veruos was haunted by Kairana's words. He remembered her warnings about the risks of tampering with loyalty, the fine line between creation and control. But like so many others, he chose to believe that his intentions were justified. In his mind, he wasn't creating a threat. He was safeguarding Reticulan society, ensuring they would have protectors in an increasingly hostile universe. The stolen research spread like an invasive species, multiplying in secret laboratories, each faction working tirelessly to outdo the others. I watched as one faction adapted the regenerative abilities meant for Icanar's descendants, using the technology not for healing but for military resilience. Another faction weaponized memory sequences, hoping to create a perfect recall ability that would turn their superspecies into the ultimate strategists, able to remember and anticipate every move of their enemies. And all the while, Kairana's voice grew fainter in their minds. The ethical considerations she had championed became relics of an idealistic past, impractical in this new age of survival and supremacy. Her once radical notions of restraint, unity, and responsibility were drowned out by the relentless march of scientific conquest. Even as her warnings echoed within the depths of the laboratories, the factions pushed forward, convinced that the benefits outweighed the costs. Yet the question persisted: who, in the end, would control these creations? In a society fractured by fear and ambition, who could claim authority over beings crafted to surpass their own creators. I watched, transfixed, as the Reticulans drifted further from what they had once been, each faction now singularly focused on winning this race. And as they moved forward, a silent specter loomed, a fear that their creations might one day surpass them, might one day see the Reticulans not as creators but as obstacles. It was a notion they dared not voice aloud, yet it crept into their thoughts, flickered in their eyes as they gazed upon their engineered masterpieces. Veruos, like many, began to sense this unspoken dread. He would look at the prototypes with a strange mix of pride and fear, as if he were staring into the eyes of a predator barely restrained by a thin glass wall. He knew that one day that wall might crack, and when it did, the Reticulans would face a reckoning, one of their own making. In his quieter moments, Veruos would return to Kairana's words, wondering if the superspecies were indeed their salvation or the seeds of their downfall. He wanted to believe that these beings, designed for loyalty and strength, would protect Reticulan society. But a quiet voice in the back of his mind kept insisting otherwise, whispering that loyalty cannot be engineered, that nature could not be forced into submission without consequences. And so, as he worked, he began to question the very fabric of their project, even as he contributed to it. He found himself pondering a truth that Kairana had foreseen long ago, that true strength did not come from genetic superiority, but from unity, from a society bound by mutual respect rather than engineered dominance. In the dim light of his laboratory, Veruos came to a painful realization. They were not creating protectors, nor were they creating a future. They were creating a mirror, one that reflected their deepest fears and darkest ambitions, a mirror that would one day force them to confront the consequences of their choices. And I, the silent observer, understood that the Reticulans had reached a tipping point. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. The bioengineered beings, the Reticulan superspecies, were now an undeniable part of society, scattered like seeds across the fabric of Reticulan civilization. For some, they represented the dawn of a new era. For others, they were a silent herald of ruin. Their presence intensified the factions' simmering tensions, as each group sought to wield this new power according to its own vision, its own warped ideals. The superspecies were no longer confined to the laboratories. I watched as they emerged into the world, their physical forms honed, their abilities surpassing that of any unmodified Reticulan, each of them a testament to the ambitions of their creators. Yet, with each encounter between unmodified Reticulans and these new beings, an uncomfortable truth surfaced. The Reticulans had not created their own evolution. They had engineered their own division. In the city of Lesra, where the ocean floor rose into luminous reefs and crystalline towers, the superspecies walked among the unmodified Reticulans for the first time. The sight was a spectacle that drew curious onlookers and wary stares alike. Children stared, wide-eyed, at the towering figures with streamlined physiques and fluid, graceful movements, while elders watched in uneasy silence, sensing an unfamiliar distance growing between them and these engineered beings. It was here, in Lesra, that the first signs of discontent began to stir. To many of the unmodified Reticulans, the superspecies appeared as something more than Reticulan, yet something less than kin. This discomfort, though subtle at first, began to fester, especially as the superspecies' unique abilities, strength, resilience, even cognitive enhancements, became evident. They could accomplish in hours what an unmodified reticulan might need days to achieve. Tasks requiring endurance, agility, or heightened senses became domains in which the superspecies thrived, leaving the unmodified reticulans to question their own place, their own worth. An incident occurred one day, trivial on the surface but powerful in its symbolism. During a routine construction effort on Lysra's central spire, a group of unmodified reticulan workers struggled to reinforce a massive, spiraling support beam. After hours of labor, a group of superspecies arrived, finishing the task in a fraction of the time. Watching the effortless strength of these modified beings, the unmodified workers felt a pang of inadequacy, a sense that their own physicality was inferior, outdated. It was the beginning of what would soon become known as the Wave of Doubt, a movement in which Reticulans across Zeta Reticuli began questioning the place of these enhanced beings in their society. Should they be trusted? Should they be embraced? Or were they, as some whispered, a threat? These doubts, once mere murmurs, grew louder, resonating across the currents and tides, reaching the ears of every faction. Amid this growing divide, a faction leader named Zarek rose to prominence. Zarek, a staunch traditionalist, had once supported the bioengineering project, but now he saw the superspecies as a menace, a disruption to the natural order of reticulan life. In his eyes, these beings were not reticulan. They were weapons, forged in the fires of ambition and wielded without understanding the consequences. Zarek, rallying his followers, began to preach against the use of bioengineering, calling for the containment and even the removal of the superspecies from reticulan society. Nature did not create these beings, he proclaimed to the crowds that gathered in the undersea plazas, and neither did evolution. They are not our children, nor our kin. They are constructs, creatures made for power, not unity, and they will tear us apart if we allow them to. His words struck a chord with many who had grown wary of the superspecies, but others dismissed him as reactionary, unwilling to accept the Reticulan's future. Yet, as I watched, I saw his influence spreading, gathering momentum as each new encounter with the superspecies deepened the fissures in Reticulan society. In response, factions that had invested heavily in the superspecies research doubled down on their creations, pouring resources into the enhancement programs to create even stronger, even more advanced beings. This new generation of superspecies was endowed not only with physical prowess, but with accelerated cognitive functions and tactical instincts, each enhancement meant to solidify the faction's superiority. The factions were no longer simply competing, they were preparing for confrontation. Amid this brewing conflict, a new and unexpected phenomenon began to emerge. Some of the superspecies, like Ikanar, had begun to develop a keen awareness of the social dynamics around them. They saw the tension in the eyes of the unmodified Reticulans, the fear that their presence evoked. Ikanar, in particular, grew increasingly aware of his own isolation, an isolation that was both imposed upon him and woven into his design. His creators had programmed loyalty into his very neural pathways, yet this sense of duty conflicted with a new feeling, an unfamiliar and unsettling awareness of his own autonomy. He began to question the nature of his existence, a question that rippled through the minds of other superspecies like an unspoken truth. Were they beings of free will, or instruments bound to serve the agendas of their creators? One evening I observed as Ikanar gathered with others of his kind in a hidden grotto, a cavern where the sounds of the ocean masked their conversation. The superspecies spoke of loyalty, of identity, of belonging. But beneath their words lay a deeper, more existential concern. Did they have a choice in who they were becoming? A superspecies named Carol raised a question that lingered in the water like a slow-moving current. "Are we Reticulan?" he asked, his voice low and reverent. "Or are we something else entirely?" The group fell silent, the question hanging between them. They knew that to answer it was to unravel their purpose, to confront the intentions of their creators, and to face the possibility that they were not truly part of the Reticulan society, but a separate, parallel existence. I watched as the weight of this realization settled upon them, a collective recognition that they were bound to a path they had never chosen. The superspecies' growing awareness only served to deepen the schism between the factions, with Zarek and his followers calling for containment, and others vying to enhance their creations further. Reticulan society found itself torn between preserving the sanctity of its identity and seizing the power of its creations. I saw Kyrna once more, her presence subdued yet steady. She spoke out against both sides, urging restraint, reminding her people of the consequences of unchecked ambition. But her words were now outnumbered, lost in the wave of fervor and fear that washed over her society. Those who once saw her as wise now viewed her as naive, unwilling to recognize the necessity of power in a galaxy fraught with threats. In secret, some of the superspecies began to wonder if they should remain loyal to their creators at all. They spoke of forming their own community, a space where they could exist without the constraints imposed upon them, without the eyes of the factions watching, measuring their worth. Ikanar, sensing the shift within his own mind, began to contemplate a path separate from those who had engineered him. He, and others like him, were becoming something that Reticulan society could not contain, a force with its own purpose, its own will. And so, as the superspecies contemplated autonomy and the factions prepared for conflict, the Reticulans teetered on the edge of a precipice, one of their own making. They had reached a crossroads, a choice that would define not only their future but the very essence of who they were. I watched with a deep and quiet anticipation, knowing that the threads of fate had been woven too tightly to be easily unwound. The Reticulans had created beings capable of transformation, but now it was the Reticulans themselves who faced the prospect of irrevocable change. And in the silent waters of Zeta Reticuli, I sensed an awakening, an understanding that to survive, they would have to decide what it truly meant to be Reticulan, and whether they could embrace beings that might one day surpass them in every conceivable way. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. As days turned into weeks, the divide between the superspecies and the unmodified Reticulans grew too stark to ignore. The faction's ambition had brought forth creations beyond their control, and now the fragile bonds of society strained against the weight of distrust, resentment, and fear. Rumors of rebellion rippled through Zeta Reticuli like shock waves, echoing in every submerged city and coral tower. In the heart of Lysra, where the superspecies mingled uneasily with the unmodified Reticulans, an incident occurred that would tip the scales irrevocably. During a public assembly, a gathering intended to foster unity and understanding, a scuffle broke out between a superspecies youth and an unmodified Reticulan elder. The elder, a respected community leader named Oran, questioned the presence of the modified beings, claiming that their very existence disrupted the social fabric of Reticulan life. "This is not evolution," he declared, his voice trembling but resolute. "This is a violation of our essence. These creatures—" He gestured toward the superspecies with a hint of distaste. "Were not shaped by our world, by our struggles. They were forced upon us. A vision of perfection we never asked for." The crowd murmured, and many unmodified Reticulans nodded in agreement, while the superspecies looked on with an expression that was half bewilderment, half defiance. But it was the words of a young superspecies named Valen that silenced the assembly. "What right do you have to decide what we are?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. "We live, we breathe, we think and feel just as you do. Or do you believe we are only tools for your factions, or worse, that we are nothing at all?" Her words stung the crowd into silence, for she had touched on the very question that haunted every Reticulan. Were these beings kin, or were they strangers in familiar skin? Was their loyalty a bond forged by purpose, or was it a shackle forced upon them? The confrontation escalated when Oran, in a fit of anger, reached out to strike Valen. In that instant, Ikanar, who had been observing quietly from the edge of the crowd, intervened. He held Oran back, his hand firm but gentle. And in that moment, something ancient broke within the hearts of the Reticulans. In that instant, I saw it. The final irreparable fracture. The assembly erupted, and within moments the once peaceful gathering had transformed into a scene of chaos. Words gave way to shouts, shouts to scuffles, and scuffles to full-blown clashes between the factions and the superspecies, each side convinced of its own right to exist on its own terms. In the days that followed, Zarek's faction seized the moment, calling for immediate containment of the superspecies. "This experiment has failed," he proclaimed to a gathering of leaders. "If we allow these beings to continue among us, they will only sow discord, bringing ruin to everything we have built." Zarek's supporters proposed a radical solution: the relocation of all superspecies to a controlled environment, an isolated habitat where they could live without interfering with unmodified society. They presented this as a compromise, a way to preserve Reticulan identity without resorting to violence. But to the superspecies, it was nothing less than an attempt to strip them of their autonomy and confine them to an existence as second-class beings. For Ikanar and his peers, containment was a line they could not allow themselves to cross. They knew that to submit to containment was to accept the role of subjects, creations bound forever to the will of their creators. And as they gathered in secret to discuss their options, I observed an extraordinary shift. They were no longer asking themselves if they could live alongside the Reticulans. They were now asking whether they could live apart. In the darkest corners of Zeta Reticuli's waters, plans were made, whispered agreements forged. If containment was forced upon them, they would resist, and as they plotted their escape, the superspecies began to glimpse a future separate from the Reticulans, a future where they could build a society of their own, free from the shackles of another's vision. Kairna, who had long been the voice of reason, watched these events unfold with a heavy heart. She had warned her people of the risks inherent in their ambitions, but now she saw those warnings realized in ways she had never imagined. The superspecies had become a society unto themselves, united not by choice, but by the rejection they faced from those who had created them. In a final attempt to bridge the growing chasm, Kairna met with Ikanar. They spoke beneath the bioluminescent glow of the kelp forests, the shimmering lights casting soft shadows across their faces. "Ikanar," she said, her voice filled with a deep sorrow, "we never intended this. You must understand, our desire was never to treat you as outsiders. You are Reticulan, as much as any of us, even if you were born from different circumstances." Ikanar regarded her with a calm that belied the storm within him. "Your words are kind, Kairna, but the actions of your people speak louder. You want us to be Reticulan, yet you hesitate to let us live as you do, to make choices as you would. How can we be kin if our very existence is seen as a threat?" Kairna fell silent, the weight of his words settling over her. She saw the truth in his gaze, a gaze that held not anger, but a resigned understanding that their paths were no longer the same. She realized that for all her wisdom, she had overlooked one simple truth. The superspecies had never been asked if they wanted to be the part of this society. They had been designed, shaped, molded, but never truly accepted. With a heavy heart, Kairna left the kelp forests, knowing that the Reticulans had sown the seeds of their own division. They had reached the point of no return. In the early hours of the next cycle, as the ocean lay still, Ikanar and a group of superspecies slipped away from Reticulan territory. They moved silently, navigating through secret routes in the coral labyrinths, their path illuminated only by the faint glow of bioluminescent flora. They carried with them nothing but the knowledge that they could no longer remain in a society that had crafted them yet rejected them. Word of the Exodus spread quickly, and the Reticulan factions awoke to the realization that their creations had abandoned them. For some, it was a moment of relief, a quiet end to the tensions that had threatened to tear their civilization apart. But for others, like Kairna, it was a profound loss, a bitter reckoning with the cost of their ambition. The superspecies vanished into the deep waters, where they would establish their own society, a new civilization built on freedom, autonomy, and the lessons learned from their creators' failures. They were no longer Reticulan, not in the sense that their creators understood. They had become something else, a people born of ambition and rejection, a society that would live on its own terms, beyond the reach of the factions that had once claimed them. And as I drifted through the currents of Zeta Reticuli, I felt the echoes of a story that had been written into the fabric of the cosmos, a tale of creation and separation, of beings who sought to transcend their limitations and, in doing so, became something new. In the wake of the Exodus, Zeta Reticuli was left to ponder the consequences of its actions. The factions had lost their creations, but they had also lost something more profound: their unity, their sense of purpose, their trust in one another. They had engineered beings to transcend the limits of their world, yet in doing so, they had severed the bonds that had once defined their civilization. Kairna, now an elder, watched as the Reticulans began to rebuild, grappling with the legacy of their ambition. She often thought of Ikanar and the others, wondering what lives they were building in the distant reaches of the ocean, and whether they had found the peace that had eluded them in Reticulan society. As for Ikanar, he and his kin charted their own course, driven by a vision of life that was both free and untethered. They would carry forward the lessons of their past, shaping a society that valued choice over control, unity over ambition. They were, in a sense, more Reticulan than their creators could ever understand, a species reborn, defined not by genetic design, but by the spirit of resilience. And I, the silent observer, floated on, watching as both societies evolved in parallel, each reflecting the other in ways they might never fully realize. For in the depths of Zeta Reticuli, a story had unfolded, a story of creation and independence, of ambition and consequence, of beings who had dared to defy the limitations of their makers, and in doing so had become something more than mere products of an experiment. They had become a testament to the enduring power of life itself. As we drift away from Zeta Reticuli, we are left with questions that echo across civilizations. What happens when ambition outpaces ethics? When creation leads to rejection? And what does it mean for a society to lose control of the very beings it created to secure its future? The Reticulans remind us that the pursuit of perfection often reveals the imperfections within us all, and that those we seek to control may ultimately shape their own destiny. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of autonomy, identity, and the delicate balance between creator and creation. Until our next journey, may you ponder the paths that you too set in motion.